Welcome back to the course, Protecting the Legal Rights of Artists and Designers. I'm Jonathan Politi, and we are working our way through the materials covering the legal system and dispute resolution. And in this segment, we will be covering court structure. Generally, we answer the question, where do lawsuits go? Relationships, expectations, process, and consequences. What do you do when things don't go as planned? How do you resolve the problems when you feel you've been wronged? In this segment, we're going to cover the structure of courts and try to get a basic lay of the land so that you should understand the differences between civil and criminal law, state and federal courts, and trial and appellate courts. The court system. Courts are the branch of government that decide controversies, provide remedies to persons who have been wronged, punishes wrongdoers, and prevents wrongdoings. When relationships go bad, courts have the power to solve problems. Now, the judicial system isn't the only option. It's possible to resolve matters amicably without using the courts. And there are other options that we'll talk about with alternative dispute resolution. But it's good to have an understanding of courts, so if you have to use them, you know what you're in for. There's this magic word, jurisdiction. It's the power of courts to hear and decide cases, the authority that they have to hear and settle disputes. You can't just go to any court to sue someone. They're organized to work a particular way, and there's a process to going to court. We will cover this more in detail in the next segment, but you should be aware, so we'll touch on this. Jurisdiction is both an empowerment and a limitation. There are categories of jurisdiction. Geography, which is connection to the person or the property based on the location of the people, the property, and events. Subject matter jurisdiction, where courts are empowered or limited to hear cases dealing with particular areas of law. Federal and state jurisdiction, depending on whether federal laws or state laws are being applied. And original versus appellate jurisdiction, with trial courts for the most part having the ability to hear cases under original jurisdiction as the first court, and appellate courts hearing cases on appeal after they've gone to trial. Let's focus in on this a little more. Courts are organized into state and federal court systems. Generally, each has 3 levels. The trial courts with original jurisdiction can hear cases as they're first presented. This is where evidence is presented to a court, such as witnesses, video, expert testimony, DNA evidence, photographs, tangible demonstrative evidence, and other proof to help support arguments for a case. Each party to a case has the opportunity to present and question evidence and challenge claims that are made against them. The trial court is where stories are told and evidence is presented. Should the parties be unhappy with the results of the trial, they can move to the next level, the appellate court. The Supreme and appellate courts review decisions of the trial courts to make sure that they've ruled correctly, properly follow due process of law with the procedures, and applying the law to the facts that are presented in the case. If the appeals court agrees with the trial court, they can affirm the decision. If the appeals court agrees with the trial court, they can affirm the decision. If the appeals court does not agree with the trial court, they can reverse the decision in favor of the other party or parties, or they can remand the decision back to the lower court to have them review their decision and to change it based on the appellate court's direction. Remember, trial courts are where cases are presented with evidence, storytelling, and proof. And the appellate courts, that's the appellate and Supreme courts, are where the courts review decisions of the lower courts. Federal and state. Organization of the courts can also be broken down into federal and state courts. Federal courts are geographically organized into circuits and districts. State courts are also organized geographically into municipalities and counties. Depending on the type of law that's involved, parties will file their cases in the respective court systems. Federal law cases in federal court and state law cases in state court. Now, that's an oversimplification to give you a general rule, but we will talk about this more when we cover jurisdiction. Right now, I want you to get the lay of the land, literally. If there's a case that involves Ohio law, then it can be filed in the state court. If the transaction took place in the Ohio borders, such as a car accident, then it can be filed in the state court. And if the parties are from Ohio, or at least the defendant, then it can be filed in state court. This is the same for other states. Each state has its own laws. Each state works with other states, and there's cooperation. And all the laws work similarly. But even though they're similar, each state has its own laws. Each state works with other states, and there's cooperation. And the laws work similarly, but even if the states are physical neighbors, they can have slightly different laws and slightly different ways of handling things, different procedures. The takeaway is that if you're doing business in different states, then you should be familiar with the laws that can affect your business directly in each state. You can get help on that from chambers of commerce and from the respective secretaries of state. Then there are federal laws. Federal laws work for all 50 states. Generally, they apply it to all the states and across state lines. The courts in the federal court system are organized into districts and circuits and look like this. In Ohio, the federal district courts are the northern and southern districts for trial courts and the Sixth Circuit for appeals. District courts are the trial courts. And the trial courts and the appeals courts are set up like this. With the federal court system, at the trial level, they're the federal district courts. They are the courts of general jurisdiction, and they can hear cases involving federal matters. There are also specialty courts, courts of limited jurisdiction that can only hear cases on certain types of laws, like tax courts or bankruptcy courts. The law in those areas is complicated and specialized and requires courts that focus on those areas. You get one judge sitting over a case at the trial level, whether general courts or specialty courts. Then there are the appellate courts. When somebody is not satisfied with the outcome of a case at the trial level, they can appeal to the higher courts to get the decision reviewed. Now, appeals courts will not relitigate the case. No new evidence, no new arguments, just looking at what happened at the trial level and making sure that the law was decided correctly and that the proper procedures were followed. 3 judges sit on a panel at the appellate level. The Federal Circuit Court of Appeals hears appeals from specialty courts, and the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals hears appeals from specialty courts or if the U.S. government is a party. That first appeal from the trial court to the appellate court is a matter of right. The appellate court will hear the case. If not happy with that result, then there's one more chance to get the decision reviewed. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the U.S. The party can file a special request called a writ of certiorari to ask the court to review the case. Usually this is reserved for matters that the court decides to address where there are conflicting decisions in lower courts or a matter of national importance that the court should hear. The lower courts did not rule correctly on a matter, and the Supreme Court can clarify. However, the court can turn down the writ. They often do. They affirm the lower court decisions. It's a similar setup with the state courts. The trial and appeal courts are set up like this. At the trial level, there are general trial courts, city and county courts. They are courts of general jurisdiction, and they can hear cases involving state laws. There are also specialty courts. Again, courts of limited jurisdiction that can only hear cases on certain types of laws, like probate matters or domestic relations. The courts focus on those areas. You got one judge sitting over a case at the trial level. Then there are the appellate courts. Again, when somebody's not happy, not satisfied with the outcome of a case at the trial level, they can appeal to the higher courts to get the decision reviewed. No relitigation of the case, no new evidence, no new arguments, just looking at what happened at the trial level and making sure that the law was decided correctly and that the proper procedures were followed. The first appeal is a matter of right. The appellate court will hear the case, and if not happy with that result, then there's one more chance to get the decision reviewed at the state Supreme Court. And again, the court can turn down the request. There is one additional step in the state court system. The matter can be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court if the matter is dealing with a law that is in conflict with federal law. So a state law that conflicts with the constitutional right, or a federal statute, or federal regulation, that can be reviewed. Remember, conflicts of law and supremacy. We talked about that. Courts will review cases in dispute dealing with federal and state laws. It's important to know if the laws are federal or state, and it's also good to know if they're dealing with a civil law, usually being enforced by an individual, or criminal law being enforced by the government. And there could be both criminal and civil cases being brought at the same time. There's a different process for civil from criminal. Both types of cases use the same court systems, though. State courts can rule on state criminal and civil matters. Federal courts can rule on federal criminal and civil matters. Again, it's important to know if it's a federal or a state law, or both, and it's important to know if it's a civil case or a criminal case, or both. We will cover that in a bit. Alright, this is a good basic visual summary of the court systems. I would suggest using the visuals in the video, and I will upload the slide decks for you to make use of as well. That will take us into the next topic of jurisdiction. That'll be covered in the next segment.